Hue of a color, we're talking about the specific color on the spectrum that we are using. A color's value corresponds to how light or dark it appears, and we can think of it in the same way we were thinking of values when painting in grayscale. And a color's saturation corresponds to the intensity of a color. So less saturated colors appear gray, while more saturated colors resemble their pigment. When you add white to any pigment, you are creating a tint of that color. As you could probably imagine, adding white to any pigment is going to brighten that color's value. Adding black to a color lowers the value and creates a shade of that color. And if we add a complementary color, or the color that lies directly across it on the color wheel, we decrease the color's saturation and create a tone. But today's video is going to focus on a color's temperature, which is a much more subjective term than everything I've talked about so far. Generally speaking, we divide the color wheel into two, both our cool colors and our warm colors. With our cool colors generally consisting of blues and our warm colors consisting of oranges and reds. But the reason why this is so subjective is because of how our brain plays tricks on us when it comes to color. Take a look at the following image. In the warm palette on the left, the highlighted block appears blue. However, that exact same color and saturation appears red when presented within the context of a cool palette. You can see when I take both of those colors out of context, they appear virtually identical and both appear more gray. The reason this is happening is because we only perceive color contextually. Have a look at this painting by Simon Stahlenhag. That's definitely a yellow house there, right? Yes. However, when we take that color out of context, we see that that's only a desaturated blue. And that red door, well, that's a desaturated blue as well. We can see the flip side of this happening in this painting by James Gurney. It's definitely a very warm reddish image, but those shadows do appear kind of blue and cold. But once again, when we isolate that color, we find that it's just a desaturated version of the main color, in this case a desaturated red. So what we've uncovered here is the basic principle behind color temperature. Desaturating a warm color makes it appear cooler, and desaturating a cool color makes it appear warmer. Our third principle is that all of our temperature shifts are going to occur when there are changes in value. So if we have cool highlights, we'll have warmer shadows, and warm highlights will generally have cooler shadows. So today when we make our paintings, we're going to choose either a warm or cool palette. Rather than introducing blues to our warm palette, we'll just use desaturated reds. And likewise with our cool palettes, we'll use desaturated blues instead of red. Just like in part 1 of the series, I'm going to start by drawing in my two-dimensional shapes of shadow. Normally I wouldn't outline this directly on the reference, I would just start doing a sketch, but for demonstration purposes here I'm outlining the shapes that I'm looking at. While I'm taking a look at these shapes, I'm thinking about what types of edges that I'd be using for each shape. For rounder shapes, I'll use a soft edge to get that nice gradual transition in value. I'll use hard edges for those quick transitions and focal points, and I'll allow my edges to sort of blur away in a lost edge for the areas I don't want the viewer to focus on. Since this is going to be my cool palette painting, you can see I just lay in a layer of blue underneath everything. As for the mechanics of how I'm going about doing this, I'm using a really soft brush and I'm painting in underneath my line layer. Right now I'm mostly focused on capturing the values. I always have my value transitions correspond to a temperature change. So you see that in my darker areas, since the shadows are warmer, I'm desaturating those blue colors. One of the reasons I like working with this sort of cloudy textural brush is it allows me to establish my colors as well as my values before figuring out what my edges are going to be. Then once I have all the colors and values sort of in place, I'll merge the line layer with the paint layer, and then I'll go back in with a full opacity brush and create some hard edges. In my experience teaching so far, that's honestly the part where students seem to mess up the most, which is just going back in with a full opacity brush and making really decisive choices about edges and shapes. Now I'm starting to get into the phase where I'm going back in with that full opacity brush, as I mentioned, and I'm basically just chopping away. Like I'll take the background value and I'll chop away at the silhouette to create a hard edge, and I'm really just trying to figure out where my solidified edges are going to be. It's a really good idea to try to group values together. So for example, all the values within the light side are going to be within a relatively limited range, and all of the values within the shadow side are going to be within a pretty limited range as well. Some of the main components of a painter's style are going to be how they handle their edges and what types of shapes they use. So try to play around with how you're handling those transitions in value. You can use a smudge tool to create a soft edge. You can use a textural brush. I discussed this in the last video, but I think it's an important point to study other painters and see what sort of techniques they're using to handle those value transitions. Now that we have a lot of the painting figured out, I can go in and get those tiny details, those small little shadow shapes that the pattern on the helmet is creating. Try to think of those lines just as shapes of shadows rather than anything more complicated. It makes it a lot easier for your brain to simplify that down. I repeated the same exact painting with a warm palette. I lose most of the footage here, so I do apologize for that. But you can see it's the exact same process where I'm starting with a loose textural brush, and then I go back in with a full opacity brush to solidify those edges and shapes. But now since we're working in a warm palette and I want my highlights to be cooler, I'm using desaturated reds as the highlights and very saturated reds as the shadows. And that's about it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.